Before screens began to glow in every hand, before engines were softened by software and silence, there was a different sound that woke the streets at dawn. A sharp metallic kick, a cough of fuel and air, then a rising mechanical heartbeat that seemed alive. Old bikes did not simply start. They announced themselves. They told a neighborhood that someone was leaving home with purpose. For an entire generation, those machines were not transportation. They were identity. They were rebellion wrapped in chrome. They were freedom balanced on two narrow tires. To understand why old bikes defined a generation, we have to return to a world that felt slower, heavier, and more uncertain. A world rebuilding itself after war. A world where factories that once forged weapons began shaping steel for something else. Something hopeful. Something personal. In the years after global conflict, economies were fragile. Families were rebuilding. Cities were crowded. Fuel was precious. Cars were expensive luxuries. But young people still needed to move. Workers still needed to travel. And dreamers still needed escape. Motorcycles became the answer. They were affordable compared to cars. They used less fuel. They were simple to repair. And most importantly, they offered independence at a price many could reach. A machine that could carry a man or woman far beyond their street, beyond their town, beyond expectation. Companies across Europe, America, and Asia saw the opportunity. Factories that once built military machines turned their skills toward civilian life. Engineers who had learned precision under pressure now applied that discipline to building durable, reliable motorcycles. These were not toys. They were tools for survival and symbols of possibility. In Britain, brands like Triumph, BSA, and Norton crafted machines that balanced elegance with mechanical toughness. Their engines were visible and honest. Their fuel tanks curved like sculpture. Their exhaust notes echoed through narrow streets and open countryside alike. In America, Harley-Davidson refined its V-twin character. Heavy, confident, unmistakable. The sound alone could turn heads from blocks away. It was less about speed and more about presence. In Germany, BMW carried forward its engineering philosophy of precision and stability. Their horizontally opposed engines gave a low center of gravity. Their machines felt planted, almost calm, even at speed. And in Japan, companies like Honda and Yamaha were quietly studying everything. They were preparing to change the world. But first, they built reliable, accessible motorcycles for everyday riders. Simple machines that started easily and rarely complained. Each region had its own philosophy, but all shared one truth. These bikes were built with purpose. The design mindset of that era was direct. Form followed function. Steel frames were welded by hands that understood vibration and stress without computers. Fuel tanks were shaped not only for style, but for knee grip and comfort. Seats were narrow yet practical. Handlebars placed riders upright, confident, exposed to wind and weather. Nothing was hidden. The engine was not concealed behind plastic. You could see the cooling fins. You could see the carburetor. You could watch the chain spin. The machine invited you to understand it, and that understanding created connection. Kickstarting an old bike was a ritual. You adjusted the choke. You found compression. You pushed down with intent. If you did it wrong, the engine would resist. If you did it right, it would reward you. There was dialogue between rider and machine. That relationship shaped character. On a cold morning, when the engine sputtered and coughed, you waited. You listened. You smelled fuel mixing with air. When it finally settled into a steady rhythm, it felt earned. Modern motorcycles start with a button. Old bikes required commitment, and that commitment defined a generation that valued patience and grit. Manufacturing in those days carried a different texture. Assembly lines were efficient, but they still relied heavily on human touch. Workers aligned engines by feel. They adjusted cables manually. Paint was applied with attention, not automation alone. Imperfections existed. Small variations, slight differences in finish. But those details made each bike subtly unique. Chrome was thick and reflective. Steel was heavy and durable. Rubber grips smelled strong in summer heat. Even the seats, often stitched by hand, carried a certain firmness that modern comfort sometimes forgets. When you rode one of these machines, you felt everything. You felt the road through the frame. You felt engine vibration through your knees. You felt wind pressure against your chest. There were no electronic shields between you and reality. At low speeds, you balanced carefully. At high speeds, you trusted instinct. Corners demanded attention. Brakes required planning. Gear shifts required coordination. But that challenge made every ride memorable. For young riders in the 1950s and 1960s, motorcycles became more than transportation. They became statements. Rock music was rising. Cinema was changing. Youth culture was finding its voice. A motorcycle parked outside a café meant something. It suggested independence. It suggested defiance. It suggested someone who refused to blend quietly into expectation. Leather jackets and steel machines became visual symbols of rebellion. But behind that image was something deeper. A desire to carve your own path in a world that had known too much order and control. The café racer culture in Britain reflected that spirit. Riders modified their bikes to go faster between cafés. They removed unnecessary weight. They lowered handlebars. They chased speed not for trophies, but for thrill. It was raw. It was imperfect. It was alive. In America, long highways stretched endlessly. Riders customized their machines with higher handlebars, extended forks, and personal paint schemes. The open road became myth and memory. Desert landscapes and coastal highways turned into stages for freedom. Every ride felt cinematic. And yet, these bikes were still practical. Workers rode them to factories. Students rode them to universities. Soldiers returning home rode them to rediscover civilian life. The motorcycle bridged worlds. It was both daily tool and weekend escape. One of the reasons these bikes defined a generation was scarcity. Not everyone owned one. When someone did, it mattered. Friends gathered around. Neighbors asked questions. Children stared. The machine carried social gravity. Listen closely to an old parallel twin engine at idle. There is a rhythm that feels organic, slightly uneven, slightly alive. It is not digitally tuned perfection. It is mechanical personality. When you twist the throttle, the response is immediate and physical. No delay, no filter. Just fuel and fire meeting steel. That sensation created memories that lasted decades. As Japanese manufacturers entered global markets in the late 1960s and 1970s, something shifted. Reliability improved dramatically. Electric starters became common. Oil leaks became rarer. Maintenance intervals grew longer. Models like the Honda CB series introduced a new standard. Smooth multi-cylinder engines, disc brakes, balanced handling. They were faster and more dependable than many competitors. But even these machines carried the spirit of the era. They were not yet softened by electronic control. They still required skill. They still demanded respect. The Kawasaki two-strokes screamed with high-pitched fury. The Yamaha twins felt eager and light. Suzuki machines blended performance with affordability. Young riders found their identity in these brands. And then there were small displacement bikes, lightweight, modestly powered machines that introduced teenagers to the road. For many, a small Honda or Yamaha was the first taste of freedom, a first step into adulthood. The memory of that first ride never fades. The first time you realize that you can travel farther than your bicycle ever allowed. The first time you feel wind at highway speed. The first time you park somewhere new and know you arrived under your own power. That is not just mobility. That is transformation. Old bikes also carried risk. Protective gear was simpler. Roads were rougher. Training was informal. Riders learned by doing. Mistakes were unforgiving. Yet that risk added intensity. It forced awareness. It sharpened focus. It created stories. Stories of late-night rides. Stories of breakdowns on country roads. Stories of friendships formed over shared tools and shared frustration. Breakdowns were common enough to be part of the culture. A loose chain, a fouled spark plug, a leaking gasket. Riders learned to carry tools. They learned to diagnose problems by sound. That mechanical intimacy built confidence beyond the machine itself. You were not just a rider. You were part mechanic, part adventurer. Compared to modern motorcycles, which are faster, smoother, and safer, old bikes feel raw. Today's machines are controlled by sensors. Traction control adjusts power. ABS prevents wheel lock. Suspension adapts automatically. Old bikes had none of that. They relied on human judgment, and that reliance built a generation that trusted feel over data. When you rode in rain, you adjusted your throttle carefully. When you braked hard, you modulated pressure by instinct. When you cornered, you leaned with faith. Modern riders benefit from incredible technology, but something intangible has changed. The conversation between rider and machine is quieter now. Old bikes spoke loudly. They vibrated. They rattled. They sang. Culturally, motorcycles shaped fashion, music, and cinema. Films portrayed riders as outsiders, heroes, wanderers. Advertisements showed wind-swept landscapes and confident silhouettes against sunset skies. The motorcycle became shorthand for freedom. But freedom meant different things to different riders. For some, it meant escape from strict social roles. For others, it meant economic mobility. For many, it simply meant quiet time alone with the road. Clubs formed around shared brands and shared journeys. Weekend rides became rituals. Roadside diners filled with parked bikes gleaming under afternoon sun. Conversations began with engines. What year? How many miles? Did you modify it? Each question opened another story. Over time, as cars became more affordable and highways more crowded, motorcycles shifted from necessity to lifestyle. But the legacy of those early decades remained strong. Collectors today restore these machines with devotion. They search for original parts. They polish chrome carefully. They rebuild carburetors by hand. Why? Because these bikes are time capsules. When you sit on one, you are transported. The seat height, the narrow tank, the weight distribution, all remind you of a different era. The smell of warm oil is nostalgic. The click of a mechanical speedometer feels honest. The analog dials, simple and clear, do not distract. They inform. Old bikes matter today because they remind us of simplicity. In a world overwhelmed by complexity, they represent clarity. You twist a throttle, you go forward. There is poetry in that. Even their imperfections feel human. Slight oil drips, minor vibrations, gentle quirks in starting procedure. They require attention. They reward care. Modern machines are brilliant, but they often feel distant. You ride them. You rarely fix them. With old bikes, ownership meant responsibility, and that responsibility created pride. Think of a young rider in the early 1970s. He saves money for months. He buys a used motorcycle. He brings it home. It is not perfect. It needs work. He spends evenings in a small garage, tools scattered around. He learns by trial and error. He scrapes his knuckles. He stains his clothes with oil. When the engine finally runs smoothly, he feels accomplishment beyond speed. That feeling defines more than transportation. It defines growth. Old bikes defined a generation because they arrived at a crossroads in history. Post-war rebuilding met youthful optimism. Industrial skill met cultural rebellion. The machines absorbed all of it. They were shaped by economic necessity and driven by emotional desire. On rural roads at sunset, a single motorcycle could carry the weight of ambition. In crowded cities, it could weave through traffic with defiance. On long highways, it could stretch time itself. The sound of an old V-twin echoing through a canyon is not just noise. It is memory amplified. And memory is powerful. Many riders who grew up in that era still remember the exact model they owned. The color, the year, the first scratch on the tank, the first long trip. Ask them, and their eyes soften. Because that motorcycle was not just metal. It was a chapter of life. As decades passed, emissions laws tightened. Safety standards increased. Fuel systems evolved. Carburetors gave way to injection. Frames became lighter and stronger. Engines became smoother. Progress is natural. Progress is necessary. But in that progress, something intangible was left behind. The raw mechanical honesty of old bikes cannot be fully replicated. They required courage. They required patience. They required attention. They rewarded loyalty. Today, when a restored classic motorcycle rolls into a modern gathering, it draws a crowd. Younger riders lean closer. They notice details that are no longer common. The exposed springs, the kickstarter lever, the simplicity of wiring. They ask questions, and through those questions, the legacy continues. Old bikes defined a generation because they were woven into daily life. They were present in first jobs, first loves, first long rides alone. They witnessed heartbreak. They carried laughter. They waited patiently in driveways. And when you rode one at night, under a sky full of stars, with no GPS and no digital distraction, you felt something rare. You felt small in a vast world. But you also felt free within it. Even today, start an old motorcycle in a quiet neighborhood, and something shifts in the air. Heads turn. Memories surface. Conversations begin. The machine connects past to present in a single ignition. These bikes were not perfect. They were sometimes unreliable. They were sometimes uncomfortable. They were often loud. But they were alive. They demanded presence. They demanded respect. They demanded involvement. And in doing so, they shaped a generation that valued authenticity. When we compare them to modern machines, the differences are clear. Modern bikes are faster than ever imagined in those early years. They corner with precision. They stop with confidence. They start in any weather. But old bikes offered something different. They offered intimacy. You did not simply ride them. You partnered with them. That partnership left marks not only on roads, but on character. In small towns and big cities alike, the sight of a motorcycle at dusk symbolized movement. It symbolized someone going somewhere new. And for a generation rebuilding itself, that mattered deeply. Today, as technology accelerates and silence replaces engine roar, the memory of those machines grows louder in contrast. They remind us of a time when motion required muscle, when sound carried personality, when metal carried meaning. They remind us that machines can shape culture. Old bikes defined an entire generation because they arrived at the perfect intersection of need and desire. They were practical enough to survive. They were emotional enough to inspire. They turned ordinary roads into adventures. They turned young riders into storytellers. And even now, decades later, when one of those machines rolls slowly past, sunlight reflecting off aged chrome, exhaust pulsing steadily, it feels like history in motion. Not preserved in a museum, but alive. Because some machines do more than move people. They move time itself. And as long as their engines can still be coaxed into life with a careful kick and a patient hand, the generation they defined will never truly fade away.